In the 1990s, audiences were continually dazzled by the new developments in CGI filmmaking. First we had the liquid metal effects in Terminator 2, then we had the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, and of course in the mid-90s we had Toy Story, which pretty much made the modern animated movie. Around the same time, Peter Jackson was working with his new company, Weta Digital, and he was looking at some effect shots they were working on for ghosts, and he realised that pretty much any movie could now be made because of CGI. He started to think about what movies were always deemed to be impossible to make, and he came up with the idea to make Lord of the Rings. Now, I think Peter was actually wrong about something there. The general feeling among filmmakers like Peter at the time was that CGI could do anything and make anything possible. But in fact, as we know, looking back, a lot of the technology was very limited at the time, and attempts to try and push it too far often backfired. So what we ended up with in the early to mid-2000s was just a lot of bad CGI. Directors didn't really know how they were going to use CGI properly, which obviously didn't help. They were pushing the technology too far, and infamously, we got a lot of shots that just kind of looked bad. What made the backlash against CGI even worse probably is the fact that not only was a lot of the CGI bad, but a lot of it was also just kind of lazy. It was the easy way to get a cheap gag. Everybody was replicating whatever the hot new effect was in Hollywood. The best example of this is probably the bullet time effect from the Matrix movies. Every movie that came out in the early 2000s had a bullet time effect. Even if it really didn't fit the tone of the movie or make sense. I'm pretty sure the Charlie's Angels movie had a bullet time effect. I know that the first Shrek movie definitely did. And also the Rob Schneider movie, Juice Bigelow, Male Gigolo, had one of those gags. It was everywhere and people started to get sick of it. This created the perception amongst moviegoers that CGI is bad and practical effects are obviously better. And at the time you can see why a lot of the time they would think that. However, that opinion has lasted way longer than it should have. It's definitely not true, and it's causing some really bad effects in the industry and to movies in general. So that's what I want to talk about today. So before we have this discussion, let's make one thing perfectly clear. The modern movies that you love, movies like The Matrix and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, would not exist without CGI. You wouldn't be getting those movies, you simply couldn't make them. You wouldn't have the Marvel movies without CGI. Or maybe you would, but they would look like the old Spider-Man TV shows, okay? It wouldn't look good. It's certainly not the movies that you go to the cinema every summer to enjoy. Now, of course, we also have to acknowledge that sometimes, even today, CGI looks bad. So why? Why does CGI sometimes look crappy when we know it can do really good things? Well, a lot of the time, you're dealing with a crew of people who have a very small budget. You have a smaller team than what you need realistically to do the number of shots, especially if it's something like a Netflix TV show where you might be making hundreds and hundreds of VFX shots, maybe even per episode. For 20 episodes, it's an awful amount of work for a small team of people to do and expect them to keep up the quality of the biggest blockbuster movies. Secondly, there's an attitude in Hollywood of we'll just fix it in post. A lot of the time, CGI teams are kind of just fixing the problems that other people have made, either directly, and literally in the case of, well, that doesn't look right, but we'll fix it later with CGI, or sometimes it was made to be filmed with CGI integrated, but the director or whoever's in charge of the shoot hasn't really thought about the practicality. When you're dealing with CGI, when you're integrating, say, a 3D character into a shot, there's a right way and a wrong way to film that. And you make the CGI team's job a lot harder if you're expecting them just to work with whatever you give them, instead of making footage that's actually had their job in mind. There's also the fact that, frankly, I think CGI is held up to a much higher standard of quality than practical effects ever were. If you watch a lot of old TV or old movies, you see bad practical effects all the time, and nobody ever mentioned it. If you watch a movie that was filmed on a soundstage, but it was supposed to be outside, which is something they did very often, like Mary Poppins, you look at the background, it's just a painted background. It's like a theatre backdrop. Nobody cared. If you watch a movie that's got a driving scene from before, like the 80s especially, it's probably going to be rear projector. It looks like James Bond driving around the Riviera, but obviously it was shot in a studio. It was shot at Pinewood or something like that. Nobody cared. When you watch a movie like Star Wars, a lot of the sets weren't real, they were paintings. It was a matte painting. The way that it was done at the time is you would film a little part of the live action. You would film your characters on the screen, and you would put a piece of glass in front of the camera and you would paint in the rest of the shot. It's quite obvious sometimes that the backgrounds are just a painting. Nobody cared. If you want a great example of the different standard that CGI is held up to now compared to practical effects back in the day, just look at the She-Hulk TV show. There's been endless amount of discussion on the internet about how apparently this is bad CGI. Despite the fact that it's a fully CGI character for a television program, this apparently looks bad. Meanwhile, their parents 40 years ago were watching Lou Ferrigno in green paint playing the Hulk, and their parents thought that looked fine. Nobody complained about this looking bad, even though it's quite obviously ridiculous. Now, having said all that, I don't want people to walk away from this video thinking that I'm saying that CGI is always better than practical effects, because it's definitely not. People do this weird thing where they kind of pit CGI and visual effects artists against practical effects, like we're in some sort of contest with each other. Every visual effects artist that I know loves traditional effects. We all love stop motion. We all love hand-drawn animation. We're really into this stuff. A lot of us, it's the reason why we got into filmmaking and things in the first place. We grew up with practical effects. We love this stuff. It can be great. When it's done right, it can be perfect. I love practical sets. I love practical props on shows. But sometimes it just isn't the right way to go. So let's talk about why CGI is actually still used if it gets such a backlash from audiences. Well, first of all, it gives directors much more creative freedom. Back in the day, if they shot something and they wanted to change something about what they shot, you would have to go back and do pickup shoots. You'd have to get all your actors back together, maybe rebuild the sets, just to change one thing. Realistically, the studio is not going to let you do that if it's a small change. These days, directors can go in and say, actually, that couch in the background, I think it's a little bit distracting. We should have went with a different couch. Can you replace that? Or the actor's hair's doing something a little bit weird there. Can you just like CG the hair so it doesn't look like that? Can you change the background out that window so actually it's a different shot or a different city? They can make changes on the fly to the project after it's all in the can, after it's all shot, and it's just something that they could never do before. Secondly, there's also practical considerations. Let's say it's the late 2000s and you have a TV show about a character who lives in New York, but the studio decides that it will be cheaper and easier if you shift production to LA for a couple of years. Well, what you could do is fly back to New York every time you want an exterior scene. That's going to be expensive, not only because you have to shift all your cameras and your crew and your actors over to New York every so often, but you also have to continually shut down streets in New York, which is very expensive. They charge a lot of money for that, and then you just kind of have to hope that the weather's going to be okay. Or you can do what Ugly Betty did at the same time and just shoot it all on green screen and nobody will be any the wiser, because why would a show like Ugly Betty even have CGI? Or let's say you're shooting a movie like Rocky or something that requires a stadium or a big crowd. What they would normally do to film something like that is they would go to an actual sporting event. Someone would get on the tannoy or on a megaphone and they would say, okay folks, we're just going to hold you up for an hour or two here, we're shooting a movie, we're going to send you some signals and we want you to shout or whatever. That can obviously be very impractical, because if this is like a Manchester United football game, they're all going to be in the wrong strip, right? The crowd is going to be wearing the wrong things. There's a lot of other practical considerations. What if someone in the crowd keeps shouting out something stupid? What if you need to go back and get more shots? You need pickup shots of the crowd. You can't do that anymore. Whereas you can just film, a boxing ring, let's say, and you can have a crowd of actual actors just around the outside. Then all the rest of it can be CGI. You have total control over the whole crowd, and it's much easier to shoot like that. Then, of course, we've got the issue of safety. It's a lot safer to blow up a CGI person than it is a real person. It's a lot easier and safer to film a guy falling downstairs and then you add CGI fire later on instead of actually setting some poor guy on fire. It's a lot easier if you have a stunt performer and he has a mask over his face, which is not going to hold up very well to close-up shots, if you can just go over the top and add a CG face, or you do a face swap. And the audience is never going to know, and this is much safer than actually risking the health of your stunt performers or your actors. Then, of course, there's the fact that there's some things that you just can't do practically that you can do with CGI. Good example of that would probably be in epic battle scenes, something like Lord of the Rings. When they were filming Lord of the Rings, they had basically every adult who can ride a horse come onto the set with their own horse. A lot of them were women, and they put fake beards on them to make it look like the riders of Rohan. They still had absolutely nowhere near enough people who could ride a horse. It just isn't possible to film a scene where you have hundreds of thousands of extras in a battle scene. For safety reasons and practical reasons and in terms of costs, you just can't do it. But that's something that you can do with CGI, and it just can't be done with practical effects or shooting in camera. The final reason that CGI is often used, and this is one that a lot of people are not going to like, but it's true, it often just looks better than practical effects. That's the reality of the situation. CGI most of the time looks completely real. The best example of this is probably when they were shooting Jurassic Park. The original intention when they were making the movie is that the smaller dinosaurs would either be puppets or people in costumes. The larger dinosaurs would be animatronic, and any shots that you had of the characters running around would be done with stop motion. They hired Phil Tippett in his studio to do the stop motion effects. Now, Phil Tippett's been working in movies since the days of Star Wars. He had pedigree on this because he did the Dragon Slayer movie, and he'd also directed a short movie that was all done in stop motion about dinosaurs. And he'd pioneered, or at least sort of perfected, this technique called go motion, which is a way to add fake motion blur to stop motion footage. So they did some tests for the movie, for the T-Rex and the Velociraptors, and they just couldn't quite get it right. Steven Spielberg wasn't happy with it, so he went to Industrial Light and Magic and said, this stop motion stuff looks very jittery. It's kind of jarring when it appears on the screen compared to the animatronics. It just looks fake. Can you morph between the frames or something to fix this footage? And they were working on it the best they could, but they couldn't really get it right. Some of the animators at ILM did a little test in secret, and they showed it to Steven Spielberg and Phil Tippett and said, this is what can be done with CGI. Almost immediately, the whole team decided that this was the way that they were going to go with the project instead. These are all professionals, there's no egos on the line, and they looked at this and said, yeah, this is obviously better. You have to remember that this is like the peak of stop motion animation versus the very early days of animating creatures in movies. In fact, I think Jurassic Park was actually the first feature-length movie that had any sort of CGI animals in it. ILM didn't even have enough animators on their crew that had experience doing animals in organic forms. What ended up happening is Phil Tippett's team used this thing, it was called the dinosaur input device, and they animated this by hand on what was essentially a stop motion rig that had motion controllers on there, so they could do motion capture by hand with a physical rig. I think that's the best example you can possibly have of people just acknowledging, even back then, that oftentimes CGI is just the most obvious choice. Before we talk about why this anti-CG attitude is bad for audiences, bad for movies, and bad for VFX artists, let's talk about something that's good for VFX artists. The Asus ProArt 16 StudioBook OLED laptop. How's that for a segue? Asus and Intel have sponsored this video, and they sent me the ProArt 16 a few weeks back to see what it can do. If you saw my last video, you'll know that I recently created a massive fantasy city scene with this computer, and I was seriously impressed with how well the Intel Core i9-3980HX processor handled millions of vertices. The rest of the specs didn't let me down either, with the RTX 4070 GPU, 64GB of RAM, and 8TB of storage. I found the Asus dial really handy to make color corrections and to alter the zoom level when I was working in Blender. The included Asus Pen 2.0 was really precise, and it can work on the ProArt 16's touchscreen or on the touchpad. The 16-inch Asus Lumina OLED display was a joy to work on. It's 3.2K resolution, touch compatible, and the color accuracy is second to none. I also really like the ProArt Creator app, which allows you to calibrate the display, monitor performance, and customize the functions of the Asus dial. Check out the link in the description to read more about the Asus ProArt StudioBook 16 OLED laptop and its 13th gen Intel processor. This narrative that CGI is bad and practical effects are good was mostly harmless when it was just a couple of nerds on the internet who were repeating opinions that they had passed down to them from other people. They have no experience with movie making. Who cares what they think? The problem we have now is that studios think this is what audiences want to hear. They think that audiences want everything to be done practical, so now they're hiding the work of visual effects artists and they're pretending that it's all done practically with no CGI. There's this narrative that's been going around for a long time, which I've never understood about Christopher Nolan, where people always say that he loves practical effects and he hates CGI. And he's been getting interviewed a lot lately for the Oppenheimer movie. And every time he opens his mouth, he's reinforcing this idea. He keeps saying, we use no CGI for this one. We use no CGI. And he's trying to reinforce this idea that he doesn't use CGI in his films. 3 of his movies have won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects. Is anybody actually believing this lie that he doesn't extensively use CGI in his movies? The bloke who did Interstellar uses no CGI in his movies, or only uses a bare minimum. Come on now. I saw an article this weekend by a man called Shad D'Souza, and the headline is, "It's exactly as they'd have done it in the 1910s, how Barbenheimer is leading the anti-CGI backlash," referring to the Oppenheimer and Barbie movies, which apparently have no CGI. Look at the picture they used. Unbelievable. You couldn't make this up. But the worst part is these journalists, they write this stuff not knowing anything about what they're talking about, and then that gets taken and that ends up on even sketchier blogs and things, and then that ends up on TikToks or on those YouTube shorts, you know, where they all use that weird voice and it's movie facts. Did you know on this movie no CGI was used because the director's a liar? And everybody just buys into that, and this becomes a fact on the internet that this movie or that movie didn't have CGI. And the worst part is, ironically, the better the CGI is in the movie, the more likely the studio is to lie and say there is no CGI in the movie. If it's completely seamless and you do your job like the best of your ability, they're going to lie and say that you weren't involved at all. The Oppenheimer movie the effects were mostly done by double negative, D-neg. Over 80% of the people who worked on that movie weren't in the credits. We've had multiple examples in the past where movies have been released with bloopers or behind the scenes shots, and they've actually paid to have the green screens or the blue screens digitally altered so they look like black, so it doesn't look obviously CG, or in some cases they've actually done digital set extensions and they've rebuilt the set for a blooper just to hide the fact that CGI is being used. Todd Vaziri, who's a well-known special effects artist who's worked on a lot of big movies you've probably seen, he maintains this huge thread on Twitter that's been going on since I think 2009, where he just constantly posts examples of studios obfuscating or just outright downplaying or lying about the use of CGI in movies, along with usually an example from like the visual effects house's showreel or something, proving that actually that was all lies. We're seeing more and more examples of this, and we're starting to even see actors get in on it. I think a lot of the time with actors, it's kind of innocent. They'll be on set and they'll see guys with practical effects or something, so then they assume it's all done practical. What often happens is they'll say something like that. Kurt Russell will say all of the de-aging was done with makeup, which obviously isn't true. He probably thought it was true though. He probably thought it was all just done with makeup. And then that ends up in the hands of some journalists who don't really do due diligence, and they'll just report on it because they know it gets clicks. So now we're in this situation where the studios are downplaying the job that the CGIers did. That makes it harder for the studios to get work. A lot of the time the studios will actually turn around and basically say, you're not allowed to talk about the work that you did on this movie. So it makes it harder for individuals to get jobs. It makes it harder for studios to get jobs. We're seeing more and more medium and small and sometimes even large studios shutting down all the time. People that I've spoke to who work in visual effects houses are saying that it's getting harder and harder to get enough people in the seats for the amount of work that they have. So it's just badly affecting everybody. It's bad for visual effects artists. It's bad for the studios in the long run. And it's bad for audiences because they don't know what they're looking at. They don't realize that what they're watching is CGI and it's not practical effects. They're being lied to, and it's never good to be lied to. So the final point that I want to make about CGI here, while I think this is all completely ridiculous in the first place, is that people can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference 90% of the time between practical effects and CGI. The reason I know this is because so many people think that these movies have no CGI, and they do. They have tons of it. Most CGI is completely invisible. It's not spaceships, it's not monsters, it's the director turning around saying, oh, I don't like the colour of that door. Can you just change the design of the door in that background shot? Can you add some more cars driving down this road? Wouldn't it be nice to have a flock of birds that fly away as the character comes through the door? It's things that nobody would ever notice. It's things that you watch a movie and you don't see this stuff. Nobody who was watching Ugly Betty in 2009 thought any of that was filmed on a green screen. Okay? Probably the best example of this, if you watch the effects shots that I was talking about earlier that Phil Tippett did for Jurassic Park, and you read the comments, a lot of people are comparing the stop motion to what they think is CGI, but actually every single shot, that CGI shot that people have a problem with, they were all puppets or animatronics. Think about that. Anyway, sorry for the rant, but it's something I've wanted to talk about for a long time. So I think it's important that more people make the voice heard, especially people like me, where I don't have to worry about getting blacklisted by a studio or getting fired or whatever, because I work for myself. So thanks for watching this video, and thanks to Asus and Intel for sponsoring. Please check out the link in the description to see more about the ProArt 16 StudioBook OLED laptop and its 13th gen Intel processor. Now I'm going to the pub because, as you can probably tell, it's warm in here, especially with the big lights on, the studio lights, and I need a pint.